bit about me. I'm a 19-year-old female, 5'10", but I only weigh 120 pounds. I'm telling you this to make one thing clear. I was in no way capable of taking this thing on. I don't have much confidence in my paranormal storytelling skills. I usually write fiction, but here we go. This occurred on the 4th of July in Virginia this year. I was at my parents' house for the summer, which was only a few miles off the North Carolina border, and nested in 7 acres of woods that was all ours. I have 2 dogs, a fat Australian cattle dog named Juno, and a cowardly black German shepherd named Karma. I also have 2 Maine Coon cats, Angel and Lily. They will become relevant later. It was the 4th of July in America, which basically means it was the biggest party day of the year. My great aunt and uncle were staying with us for a week, and today was their last day here. My parents decided to take them to the waterfront in Virginia Beach to watch the fireworks and bar hop. I'm not a party goer, so I elected to stay at home and watch the dogs for the night. I waved to my family as they began to drive away, cupping my hands over my mouth. I yelled, "For God's sake, be careful," a phrase my dad always said to people leaving. Little did I know that I was going to be the one who needed to be careful that night. Let me recount the events leading up to my encounter. Skip forward a few hours. I made myself dinner and walked the dogs through the woods before it got dark. Normally the dogs would run through the woods chasing animals or each other, but tonight they stuck close to my side. First unusual occurrence of the night. I decided to treat myself that night and got into my parents' jacuzzi tub for a bubble bath. The tub is in the corner of the large bathroom with a window on both walls that had warped glass that you couldn't see through, probably to ensure privacy in the bath. This bathroom is in the back left corner of the house, and the windows face the forest outside. I was relaxing until I heard scratching at the door. Not even 2 seconds later, the door opened. Karma walked in. She knows how to open doors, and, to my shock, Lily followed. Now, these 2 hate each other. I've never seen them in the same room peacefully, but here they were, coming into the bathroom together. The dog laid down next to the bottom step that led to the tub. The cat right above her on said step. Second unusual occurrence of the night. While drying off after my bath, both Karma and Lily were staring at the windows with warped glass. I saw Karma's hackles raised, Lily fluffed up to twice her usual size. Wildlife was common around here, so I guessed a raccoon or an opossum was climbing our fence again. I brushed it off. I walked to the sitting room on my way to the kitchen. Here there is access to our back porch and fenced-in backyard. The door was clear glass with a second bug screen sliding door. Here Juno and Angel were facing the door. These 2 get along but are by no means friends. They're staring in the same direction my other animals were, hackles raised. A low growl came from Angel. I've never heard her growl in my life. I couldn't see what they were looking at in the pitch dark. It was well after midnight and cloudy. Third unusual occurrence of the night. I could list some other small happenings, but I don't want to make this too long. Just know that my animals were acting bizarre, and no, there were no fireworks in my area that startled them. I'm a night owl. Staying up until the sun rises is my forte. So being up at 2 in the morning wasn't unusual for me. I've gotten used to the little trembles and bumps that go in the night around my summer home. But tonight I heard something different. It was subtle at first. I barely noticed it. The sound of rustling in the brush, a sweeping sound you hear when something passes close to a bush. I heard it once, twice, 3 times. I watched my animals again, their ears swiveling in the direction of the noises. By now I was up and checking all the locks on the doors and windows. I had heard some gangs were breaking into unsuspecting country homes as part of an initiation. I wasn't going to be the next victim. The noise outside came by again. Were they circling the house? My heart jumped to my throat at the thought of someone or something prowling in the night around my home, especially when my dad wasn't home. The cats had retreated upstairs and hid. Karma refused to come out of the bathroom in the house. It had no windows. Juno was the only one that stayed with me. But her presence was barely comforting, given she was a sausage with legs. All bark, no bite. Okay, this is the 5th or 6th time it's come by the window. I'm starting to freak. Panic disorders are fantastic to have in these situations. Not. I closed my computer before turning off the light beside me, removing every distraction so I could focus on the noise. Everything was silent, save for the crickets and bugs singing the song of summer nights. I pressed against the wall next to a window. Now these windows are at least lifted 4 or 5 feet off the ground. In front of this one, there was a high bush standing 5 or 6 feet from the earth, blocking a part of the window. The leaves of the bush didn't begin until at least 2 feet above the ground. The rest we had trimmed. Enough with the landscaping. What does this have to do with the story? I'll tell you. I stood there for what seemed like forever, but in reality, only a few minutes had passed. My unwelcome guest was coming by again. I heard it brush against the leaves, not just to graze, but a large part of its body had rustled the bush. Now remember the size of the bush I mentioned. The leaves didn't begin until at least 2 feet up, and the bush was taller than the average person. This thing was big. It sounded like it was dragging something, but it was hard to tell without pressing my ear right to the glass, which I wasn't about to do. I wait for the thing to move further away before slinking to the window. It had already passed. The next window, it wasn't there. This window was past where the fence started. It was circling the fence as well. I now knew it wasn't a burglar. Most of our good, expensive items were stored in the separate garage that had plenty of low windows and a trick door that barely locked. It was moving itself through the small walkway between my house and the garage. The close quarters caused it to disturb the bush on one side, completely avoiding the treasure trove next door. Whatever was out there had an interest in what was in the house. Silently, I think, whatever god there is, as it began to trek around the fence. I was given some time to move before it came for a walk by again. Looking back, I wondered why I didn't call the police. In my dad's office, located next to the jacuzzi bathroom, he has a safe. I'm not supposed to know the combination, but I saw my mom put it in and memorized it. Thank God I did. I punch in the 4 digits and twisted the handle to open the safe. Reaching my hand into the compartment on the door and pulling out my dad's loaded handgun. I knew it was there because my dad showed me his flawless plan to take down anyone who forced him to open that safe. I'm a shit shot with handguns. Rifles I'm great. Handguns, not so much. I've been taught to shoot by my dad since I was 8, yet I could never fire a handgun without being blown back. But I keep it with me, feeling comfort in its power. I freeze. Rustling came from outside the office window. There were no outdoor lights to turn on to identify this thing. Quietly, I moved down the hall. Karma was cowering in my bathroom. Juno had joined her. There goes my guard dog. I sigh and move forward, coming to the front door. Part of the door was glass, but it was a warped kind of stained glass you could only see shadows through. I knelt down below the window part, pressing myself to the door to remain out of sight. Dragging on concrete. It was on the driveway. I peeked at the locks, ensuring they were secured. For about 30 seconds, I can only hear my breathing. When did I start breathing this hard? Scraping, a flop, a warbled grunt. Oh God, it was trying to come up the steps. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't familiar with small brick steps. Anyone or anything with big feet had issues with those tiny stairs. My throat is dry. I wonder when I started crying. I hear it try again. This time it made it up further. Whether it was on 2 or 4 legs would determine how far it was from the door. But I didn't know. My gun sat, forgotten, on the ground as I listened. I started when I heard the knob on the door jiggle. I'm on the floor holding myself up with my elbows, looking at the moving handle, nails lightly scraping against the wood. I hear heavy breathing, slow but deep. Then it starts to speak. It tested its voice, fluctuating pitches like a singer trying to find the right note. Ah, ah, ah. A level volume, but completely different voices with each test. My hands cover my mouth to keep myself from screaming. That summer I discovered the glory of Let's Read horror stories on YouTube. Elle Fraser, Lazy Masquerade, Corpse Husband, Unit Number 522, Your Maker, but I digress. I remembered Skinwalker stories. The Our Cabin Getaway story in the forefront of my mind. The thing found its pitch. Matt, where'd you get off to? It was my neighbor's voice, Sarah, but it wasn't. It's just like they say the voice sounds glitched. Not right. Matt? Matt? It repeats something even more warped as it dragged out the syllable. "Come on, ladies," it says, Sarah again. What she said to shoo her hands back into the cup. "Come on, Matt." The tone changed mid-sentence, like stitching two sound bits. This entire encounter at the door happened in 2 minutes, probably a lot less, but it seemed like forever. And I heard the whistle. That familiar 4th of July noise. A firework exploded in the distance, filling the sky with light. For a second, I look up at the stained glass, see the shadow of my visitor. If I had to guess now, it was over 4 feet and probably hunched over the steps. I hear a sudden scatter and scraping as the creature takes off from the front steps. I jump back from the door in shock after hearing it move so fast. Distant crashing in the woods. Another firework pops. A garbled scream fading. Red, white, and blue light filled the sky, shining down onto me, still watching the window. It was gone. This is the one time I can say I'm thankful for obnoxious Americans and illegal fireworks. I didn't tell my parents when they came home the next morning. I returned the gun to the safe, well before my dad could even notice it missing. This is my first time telling the tale. Looking back, I see how dumb I was not calling for help. For even taking the gun, though I knew I couldn't do jack shit with it. I have so many regrets from that night, but I'm thankful I locked the windows and doors. If I had gone to bed early, if I hadn't paid attention to the noises, who knows what would have happened? I've only ever heard of skinwalkers in the West. Does anyone know if they're in the East as well? Or is it something different? Nevertheless, terrifying creature at my door. Let's not meet. In this story, I was about 4 or 5. One day I had walked outside to play in my pool with my friend. As we did this, my dad said he was going to Home Depot, and my mom was inside if we needed her. After about an hour, I saw someone on my second-story deck. I mentioned it to my friend, and he said something along the lines of, "Oh, it must be your dad." My deck was around 50 to 70 feet from my pool, so I couldn't make out clearly who or what it was. My mom came out while the figure was still in view. I asked if Dad was back, and she said that he had called her telling her he would be another hour. On top of that, his truck never came back. All 3 of us looked back at the deck, seeing nothing. After this, me and my friend retired to my room, and we played on my Nintendo 64. My dad came back around 30 minutes after this, and we told him what happened. He theorized that we may have built our house on a Native American burial ground. Half as a joke, half serious. Since the area in Texas we lived in was known Comanche territory back in the day. Later that night we went to bed, but I was awakened by a sharp kick that resonated through my head as if someone had purposefully kicked it from underneath. I checked if my friend had done it, but to my dismay, he was still in bed. I never told anyone about this until I discovered a few arrowheads on our property about 2 years after the incident. Turns out my mom had felt the jolt lots when she slept downstairs, in the spare bedroom. Nothing else came of the situation until a week before we moved out. I heard scratching coming from an access panel that led to the area under our house, which can only be described as a basement with a dirt floor. Needless to say, I ran upstairs and told my parents, who bravely, at the time, opened the hatch and told whoever it was to shoo, thinking it was a raccoon or something of a furry nature. Once again that night I felt the jolt through my head. I really don't know if all this was just a child's imagination or a vivid dream. But my mom experienced it as well, making it all the more eerie. To top it all off, cut to 15 years later, me and my dad revisited the old house, which was back on the market. I asked the seller if they found it peaceful out where it was. They said yes, but I swear there is some ghost or something in this house. Every Sunday morning for the past month, a glass falls in the kitchen at 9 a.m. exactly. You know anything about that? My dad and I just stared at each other and more or less ran the hell out of there, not turning back. So I live in a small community called Skellerton in Cairns, Nova Scotia province. I'm 13 now, but at the time this takes place, I would say I was around 9 to 10 years old. Nothing much really happens here, but this did scare me enough for me to share it, so around 2012, I would be downstairs watching TV and shows I'm way too young for, like Family Guy. I looked out my window in my living room once and saw what I thought was a black coat hung up, but I'm not sure anymore. At the time, I ignored it. In the night 2 months later, it was there again, and this time I saw it move, so I thought someone was watching. So I slept down somewhere else, closed my blinds of course. My dad would open them when I'm sleeping, and when I walked to elementary school, the house blinds would always be closed. The one night, I also saw nothing there, and the next moment, saw someone dressed all in black. I could not see the face, looking into my house. I again sat out of view. In June 2012, I went up to visit family in Grand Pierre, located in the Alberta province. And nothing happened up there, of course. When I went back to Stellarton in around May 2013, I saw it again, and I got a look at his face, and I swear, I saw him smile. I pretty much shit a brick, and ran off the room until I got the courage to go back. It was again just him wearing black. He hid his face again. The next morning when I went to school, the blinds were closed, but I still ran to school as fast as I could. It has been 3 years since whoever lived there moved out, and nothing happened since, and I have since gotten over this experience, but I still wonder, what if he ever entered my house? October 16th, 2014. I was a little boy when this happened. My house was built over 75 years ago, so it is old. People who lived in that house before us had died in that house. I think the original owners were named JD something. Why? Well, in our basement, I think it's a name, but I'm not sure. It says JD in spray paint. I never thought much of it until this night. My dad's room is right beside mine, and on the other side of my room is a bathroom and a hallway. I always hear strange sounds such as whispers and loud steps going across the ground, but I never thought much of it. So one night, I got up to use the bathroom and I left the door open. And when I left it open, I could see all down the hallway. As I looked over the hallway, I saw a black smudge go across. At this point, I was very paranoid, so I finished up in the bathroom and turned to look. And what I saw was unforgettable. I saw a dark, fuzzy-looking man with a disfigured face. I screamed so loud I woke my dad up and got a hold of his revolver. And my dad found me and told me to go into my room. I felt much better. He had been SWAT and a police instructor for almost 30 years. I grabbed a knife that I kept on my nightstand and opened it. And as I did, I heard a loud gunshot. My dad had shot the wall. He also saw the person or demon or whatever it was. And we called 911 and had the police search the house. And me and my dad stayed awake all night. Since then, we fixed the gunshot hole and never heard anything more. So because of, well, life, I got my license at 22 rather than 17, like most kids in my state. But I didn't mind. I was just happy to be able to drive. The first thing I did when I got my license was start driving everywhere, just to learn the ropes. I drove to places my parents would never bother to go, let alone take me. And oftentimes, I would get lost on purpose, and then let my GPS bring me home. Once I get used to daytime driving, I switched to nights. And it was one of my late night drives in particular that is of note. So I was in a town where my dad had grown up about 20 minutes from, where he and myself lived at the time. I would also like to point out that by late night, I meant about 2 in the morning, so there was almost no one on the roads in the town that goes to bed by 9. While on a road that ran along the length of a small brook, I came to a T-shaped intersection where I had the right of way, but in the intersection on the other road was what looked like from a distance in the dark to be a 1970s Mustang or similar classic car. As it pulled up to the stop sign, it had its blinker on to pull out in the same direction as me. As I did not want to be tailgated by a potential asshole, I slowed right the fuck down to a near crawl, hoping it would pull out in front of me. Now here's the part where I'd say he waited, pulled out behind me, and tailed me for hours, but nope. Instead, my view of the car passes behind a large oak tree, and as I pass the tree, the car is gone. Just fucking no longer there. It was behind the tree for maybe 2 seconds at most. So me being no stranger to freaky shit like this, I'm overcome with joy that I saw something cool that night, rather than being scared. But then my skeptic brain kicks in, and I decide to see if maybe it pulled into a driveway or something. So I turn around and search the area. Nothing. No driveways, no cars in a ditch, nothing. It was about this time that my phone rings, so being a safe driver, I pull off to the side of the road and answer it. It's my dad wondering where the fuck I was, why I was driving at 2:30 in the morning. After I calm him down and say I'll be home by 3, I proceed to tell him what happened. My dad, being the kind of guy that must actually see a ghost for himself before he believes they exist, simply says that although he believes me, he doesn't find it nearly as cool as me, and repeats that I should get home soon. So I head home, and nothing else happened. This story is what I like to think of as my first real scary encounter of the paranormal. Previous to this, I had some odd occurrences happen to me, but nothing like this. Everything in this story is true, and although some of it can be explained to the nature of the place, well, some of it cannot be explained. It was the summer after finishing college, about to go to university. I live in England, and the town that I live in is rather small, just outside of a large city. The location that the event took place in was a house a few doors away from my small, semi-rural street. My friend at the time, let's call her Emily, had family friends who owned a house on the street that I live on. The house was a large Victorian villa, painted pink, and faced a large field. One day, Emily texted me saying that she needed to house sit the house, as her family friends were going away. I can't remember exactly why she needed to be in the house to keep an eye on things, but she needed to stay there for a week. Naturally, as I was only a few doors down from this house, she asked if I would like to keep her company for a few nights, watch some films, and have a few drinks. We went out and bought some snacks and went to the house. I remember it was a really warm day, and roughly 5 p.m. when we went to the house. The first thing I noticed was as soon as I had walked into the house, it was so cold. Granted, it was an old house and they are cool, but I remember feeling really cold. The air was completely different from walking outside to inside. We settled down in the house, had a look around the place, and made some food. Everything is calm and nothing occurred for the first few hours we were there. We watched things on TV and had a gossip, the usual stuff. It got dark and I remember seeing sun setting over the large field outside of the house. Once the sun had gone down, that's when things started to get weird. The first thing I noticed was the floorboards creaking above us. At first I thought, being that it was an old house and being a warm day, it was just natural noises coming from the wood as it got cooler. But it seemed to be constant. After an hour or so, we both noticed how weird it was. It was almost like someone was upstairs walking around. We did have a panic, and went to the foot of the staircase and listened out for anything. I remember then being really spooked. It was dark as well, as the light bulb for the downstairs had broken, so we had no light apart from the light from the living room we had just come from. We stood there for a minute after, but then returned to the living room and carried on watching the TV. Still feeling a bit spooked, and at that point I was freezing cold. I got a blanket and curled up on the sofa. A few hours passed and we found a film to watch on the TV. I forget what it was. At this point it was pitch black outside and we had all the lights on in the house because we were feeling a bit spooked. I remember seeing lights at the corner of my eye a lot, as if something was running in and out of the kitchen door. Time went on, and we watched the film, until I got this terrible feeling. It was horrible. Like a cold hand was poking my back, and I had shivers down my spine. I think Emily felt the same as well because we both looked at each other, spooked. We were both under a blanket at this point. I was on one side of the sofa and Emily on the other, watching the film on TV, trying to forget what had happened. But roughly 10 minutes later, something really strange happened. I would like to firstly point out that the lights in the living room were the usual switch on off sort of thing, but as we sat there, the lights all gradually dimmed until they completely went out. We both freaked. Emily jumped right over to my side of the sofa, and we were both speechless. I remember feeling so scared that I wanted to cry. After 10, maybe 15 minutes of being freaked out, I got the courage to go try the lights to see if maybe they had just blown out in a weird way. But to my surprise, the lights just turned on as normal. It sent shivers down my spine. At this point, it was really late, and we both decided to try and sleep. We walked to the staircase, and I remembered us both stood at the bottom, looking up, thinking how we will get into bed without freaking ourselves out. We both ran as fast as we could up the stairs, and ran into the rooms we were going to sleep in. I was staying in a small guest bedroom which was next to the bathroom, and on the other side of the house, Emily slept in the master bedroom. I got into bed, threw the covers over myself, and hoped that I would fall asleep. That didn't happen. I was dying to use the toilet, but I was so scared to leave the bedroom. After an hour, I decided I would run into the bathroom, do my business, and run back to bed. I got on the toilet and sat there for a moment. As I did, I noticed everything was really cold. I had a really horrible feeling about the bathroom and just wanted to do my business and get out. As I sat there, I noticed there were shadows darting around the bathroom. I froze in shock and wanted to run out as soon as I could. I looked through the doorway, and it looked as though there was someone stood the other side of the door. You know, like the shadow you get if there is a light on outside a door. Problem was, there wasn't a light on outside the door. It was weird. I jumped off the toilet and ran into the bedroom I was sleeping in and threw myself under the covers, hoping for sleep. A few hours passed, and I didn't sleep a wink. I didn't dare look over my covers in case I saw anything which would freak me out. By now it must have been 4 a.m. and the faint sound of birds singing was in the air. It brought some comfort, and I relaxed a little. At this point, I decided to look over my covers and around the room. Nothing there. I was thankful and looked around the room some more. I even looked out the window, looking for some light in the night sky. But then I turned around and noticed a really old TV in the room, which I didn't really notice much earlier. It had a strange glow to it. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks, and then realized that those old TVs sometimes give off a faint glow when they're turned off, but plugged in. Feeling cocky, I got out of bed to unplug the TV, as not to freak myself out anymore. I froze when I realized the TV wasn't plugged into the wall, and worst of all, the wire had been cut completely in half. My eyes widened, and I ran into bed freaked out. I peered over the covers once again, and saw that the TV still had the glow, but now it had what seemed like hands, running over the weird static-like glow on the screen. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I swear that night lasted a lifetime. It eventually was morning, and I had not slept at all. Being late, I went downstairs because, you know, nothing bad ever happens in the daytime. I sat in the kitchen and lit a cigarette. I promised myself I would never step into this house again. Emily eventually woke up and I got out of the house as soon as I could. I slept all day at home. It was bliss. No creepy house to think about or anything. That was until I got a phone call. Emily calling to ask if I could come over again to the house. I saying how tired I was, how I couldn't because of how freaked I was, but somehow she convinced me to come over again. I told her that I would, but only if I could stay in the same room as her. So I went back over. I hated the feeling of walking around that house. Emily greeted me at the door and we settled in for the night, watching more films, trying to forget everything in the house which made it creepy as hell. Apparently, Emily had not had anything odd or weird happen to her at all last night. The night was very uneventful. Nothing happened. Just the odd creak here and there, but nothing else. It put my mind at rest and I relaxed a little. We called it a night at around 12 a.m. and went to bed. As I agreed, I didn't want to stay in the guest room again, so I stayed in the master bedroom in the large double bed with Emily. I fell asleep pretty quickly and had a good rest. That was until I woke up in the night. Not sure on the time, but it was still dark out. I slept next to a large walk-in wardrobe with the door next to the bed. I remember it had been closed when I had gone to bed, but when I woke up, it was slightly open. I looked and thought, weird, but didn't think anything odd about it. I closed my eyes again, opened them, and it was slightly more open. What the fuck? Am I dreaming or something? It was still a night with no wind at all, so what was opening this door? I started to freak again and put the covers over my head, not wanting to see anything. I had been like this for a few moments when I saw a pink light run across the ceiling. So bright, I could see it from under the covers. I look out for a moment, thinking it could be a car outside, but this wasn't like anything from a car. It looked like someone had a laser printer and was going over the ceiling. The curtains were closed, so it couldn't have been anyone from outside. It was odd, but weirdly comforting. I heard a creak and noticed the door to the wardrobe open a bit more. My eyes widened, and I looked around to see this light going crazy. Then the door slowly closed again. I didn't know how to feel. I lay back down and somehow fell asleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but I woke up again. Still dark out. But I was laughing. And Emily was laughing. Not a sort of a laugh, but a hysterical sort of laugh. When I came to my senses, I noticed I was jiggling something. I looked down to my arms, and I had both of my hands on Emily's breasts, and I was juggling them up and down as we both laughed. I freaked out and stopped. I was so confused and didn't know how this happened. I tried to talk to Emily, saying sorry for what happened, but she was fast asleep. What the fuck just happened? I was awake. I know I didn't do this on purpose. Something happened in my sleep. I can't explain it. Morning soon arrived, and I had slept till late. We both had. I knew from then that I did not or could not stay around this house anymore. I said my goodbyes and went home. never returned to that house again. Emily went on to stay in the house for a few more nights with her brother, but she never mentioned anything odd happening. I still live around the corner from that house, and whenever I walk past the house, I still get a shiver down my spine. This story, in addition to story number 3, was originally posted on Reddit by user ThoughtTMusic. When I was a kid, a very popular pastime at my house was to play hide and go seek in my basement. The thrill of hiding combined with the basement's general creep factor made for an invigorating game. As I explained in my previous post, there were certain rooms in my basement that I made a point to avoid at all times, and the storage room was at the top of that list. My basement in general is a place of extreme creepiness and, in short, is haunted by a woman, or at least something that portrays itself as a woman. Bottom line, she plagued my childhood with constant terror and trickery. Anyways, that day, I experienced game after game of being found quicker than others, and I was getting frustrated. The idea popped in my head to surprise everyone by hiding in the one place they would never think to look for me: the storage room. I was pretty uneasy about this decision as it went against everything I believed. But my desire to win outmatched the logic centers of my brain. The storage room was a dark and dank place that consisted of a giant square shelf in the middle of the room with a path carved out around it. It was filled with items ranging from Christmas lawn elves, Halloween decorations, china, tools, dressers, etc. So even with the lights turned on, there was plenty of creepy things staring back at you the entire time you were in there. It was my friend Kay's turn to start counting, and I was giddy with excitement to win. She started counting down from 20, and I bolted towards one of my common rooms, but lagged slightly behind everyone else so I could divert to the storage room at the very last second, to conceal my plan from my friends. Last thing I needed was to be ratted out after my other friends were caught. I was in it to win it. I slid open the storage room door, turned on the lights, and closed the door behind me. It was cold and damp, which was the norm for this room, but nothing I couldn't handle. Since I was already out of time at this point, I had to make a quick decision on where to hide. So I ducked down behind a piece of luggage that barely concealed me. This was not ideal, and there were definitely more complex paths through the stored items that I could hide in. But I already heard someone outside the door and didn't have time to search for a better option. I see Kay slide open the door and come into the room to look around. I figured I must have made too much noise when closing the doors, so she knew I was in here. She was rubbing her shoulders, highlighting the temperature difference from the other rooms to this one, something my adrenaline had made me forget about. It was definitely cold. She and another friend of mine came in and began to scan the room, looking for any disturbances. As they did this, I began to feel a chill run up my spine and the hair stood up on my arm. The temperature almost seemed to be getting colder, and Kay reflected this as she began to hug herself for warmth. Despite familiar warning signs and rising creep factors that were quickly highlighting my poor decision to hide in this spot, Kay was quickly approaching me, and in mere seconds, I would be smack dab in the center of her line of sight, ending the game and allowing us to leave the room. She stands almost directly in front of the piece of luggage I was crouched behind and pans her head around the room again. Something was off. Kay hated this room as much as I did, and wasn't about to play a joke, as I knew she wanted to leave it just as much as I did. But despite me being clearly in her view, she was acting like she didn't even see me. She even looked down at me to where we pretty much made eye contact, only for her brow to wrinkle and head to cock to the side like someone would do when they were sure they were right about something, only to be informed they weren't. She let out a, "Huh," and my other friend asked, "Anything?" "No," she replied in a puzzled tone. I stared up at her with a helpless look of confusion on my face as I grew even colder. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, as Kay was neither the type to play pranks nor a good enough actor to look right at me and not break character. She backed away from me, turned, and began walking towards the door, while still scanning the room and checking behind other items. I sat up in my spot, completely dumbfounded and confused, watching them as I hear a friend in the distance shout, "He's here." And just like that, Kay flipped the light off and slid the door shut. I was alone in the dark. In the room I feared the most inside my haunted house, and the only people that made me feel safe enough to do such a thing just left. All the while seemingly unaware I was here. It was freezing, and despite having a small window that often illuminated the room, it was still pitch black. Despite being around noon on a sunny summer day, the light that should be coming through the window wasn't making a dent on the darkness. I sat in complete silence for a moment, breathing hard and quietly freaking out. In fact, it was so quiet my ears began to ring. The ringing was broken when I began to hear slight noises and creaks, like someone was shifting their way through the mess of items at random places in the room. I was petrified with fear, and all the hairs on my body stood up straight as I began to get an unusual feeling. Have you ever hid somewhere creepy or dark, but since you were hiding there with someone else, you still felt creeped out? But you also felt safe because someone you knew was behind you. I had that sense. The sense that someone was behind me, hiding with me. I started to feel something touch my back in a way that I could only describe as someone doing the itsy bitsy spider, with their fingers walking from my lower back to my shoulders. I was too scared to move from where I was because the path to the door was an obstacle course, even with the lights on, and would be a complete disaster with the lights off. I imagined trying to run to the door and being chased down by whatever was behind me and tripping, which was unnerving to say the least. I needed help. I put my hands over my ears and just started to scream, "Help!" at the top of my lungs. I said it over and over and over, as I felt more hands touching my arms, my head, and fingers running through my hair. I kept shouting as loud as I could and began to feel a cold breath right in my ear despite my hand covering it. Still with the ears covered and the eyes closed, the touching finally stopped. I then felt someone start rubbing my back in the same consoling way that only my mom did when I would have a bad day or be sad about something. I heard the muffled voice of my mom say, "What's wrong?" I was overjoyed and quickly dropped my hands, lifted my head and opened my eyes to thank my mother for saving me. It was pitch dark. I had it at this point. I was about 5 minutes overdue for an epic noping the fuck out of there. I burst up from my spot and took very short but quick steps towards where I thought the door was. It wasn't graceful by any means, and I knocked over a ton of stuff, but I finally hit the door and slid it open to the family room and slammed the door behind me. The light was on, but it was empty. This was the room that we all gathered in after each game, or even while looking for others, and there generally was at least 1 or 2 people hanging out in here while others were still off searching. I was confused, but I heard voices coming from the rooms on the other side of the basement. I cautiously walked over to the doorway of the spare room and could see my friends looking in the walk-in closet, my other most hated room in the basement, with their backs to me. Reluctantly, I asked, "What are you guys doing?" They all jumped and looked completely freaked out. I was furious and asked why they left me in the storage room, ignored my screams, and why they were on the other side of the basement. Kay, noticeably weirded out, swore to me that she never saw me, and then explained that she and everyone else started hearing my voice in the spare bedroom closet. Apparently, when they would all pour into the closet to try to find me, they would then start to hear my voice in the office, then the bathroom, then the laundry room. They couldn't figure out how I was evading them, only to lure them to different rooms to then evade them again. I told them I was never in any of those rooms and had been in the storage room the entire time. Seconds later, we were bursting out of the back door of the house. I told them what happened to me, and Kay felt so bad that she didn't see or help me, as she was almost in tears. Needless to say, we took a break from the game for a while. Sadly, this was just one afternoon in a haunted house that I lived in for 18 years, and events like this were far more common than I'd like to admit. I still, to this day, rarely ever go back into that room. Being a pretty girl, I've had my fair share of creepers on the bus. But this one was the worst. When I was 18, this dude, who I swear looked almost exactly like Popeye, followed me home from the bus stop. I thought he was just heading the same way as me, so I shrugged it off, especially since he disappeared when I went up my front steps. I proceeded to see this guy every other day, still going the same direction as me from the bus stop. Since he never stopped staring at me when we were on the bus, I put 2 and 2 together and figured out this dude was clearly stalking me. Now I'm almost 6 feet tall, so I was significantly larger than him, and could have easily kicked his ass. But I was still so terrified, especially since the people I occasionally saw him with were his workmates, who were big, muscular tradesmen. They were honestly some of the creepiest people I've ever seen. Who knows what could have happened with them? At this point in time, I was sleeping on the couch in the family room, which faces the backyard. I would hear rustling, grunting, footsteps, and thumping in the yard every single night, even tapping on the windows and doors. This went on for months. I didn't think to tell my parents because, honestly, who would believe a teenager who said a dude who looked like Popeye was stalking them? Definitely not me. For the school holidays, my mom and I went to New Zealand. I visited some friends, while my mom did a tour on the North Island. We were gone for 2 weeks. I think my stalker must have gotten bored because I was gone so long, so he never came back. Now, part of the reason I knew no one would believe me about the stalker is I was having a mental breakdown. I decided to move to New Zealand to try to regain my sanity. Much to my objection, I ended up moving back home 7 months later. About a month or two after I came back, I took a bus to a mall across town. Little did I realize the stalker was on the bus. When I saw him get off, my heart sank. He'd spotted me, so he tried following me. Remembering I had a friend who worked at a store in the mall, I ran straight to him. He stayed with me for a bit, while I was trying so hard not to have a panic attack. I left immediately after. It's now 5 years later and I haven't seen him since. So happy I don't catch buses anymore. A few weeks ago, some adorable stray kittens decided to make a home in my yard. It got my dad and I talking about animals and stuff that have been in our yard. I decided to mention my stalker to him. He said he'd known the whole time. This experience left me terrified after playing Pokemon Go. Note, I'm never going at night again. One day my friends wanted me to play Pokemon Go with them. I have to tell you that I'm no good at playing Pokemon. I was only level 5 at the time and we went out to hunt down Pokemon around my small town. I left about 8 p.m. with 2 of my friends. We drove around grabbing Pokemon like everyone would do with the app. At around an hour in driving around, my friends and I took over gyms. My friend got a call from his mother to come home, so we left for his house. When we arrived, we got out of his car, and we went to a park about a mile away from my house. We went around the park on foot for about an hour and a half. And this is where my experience goes bad. It's about 10:45 p.m., so it's dark out, and my phone ran out of battery because I haven't charged it when I left my house. I told my friends that I had to go home and asked if one of them could give me a ride. They told me they couldn't go, so I went walking. I left being mad at them for making me go with them, walking a mile away from my house, but it is my fault for going with them in the first place. As I was walking in the dark alone, I see people walking down the streets. I was relieved that there's people around, even though Pokemon Go is popular in my town. I kept walking down the sidewalk and came up ahead 2 roads that I didn't know existed at this point. I got lost and didn't know where my house was, so I kept walking straight. I took a left to a neighborhood and noticed an alley in the corner of my eye. There were bushes on the left side of the alley, so I started my way there. On my way walking, there was a strange noise next to the bushes. I stopped. and thought to myself that an animal was there, so I kept walking. Then the noise became louder, so I stopped again for a second time. I took a glimpse around. I saw a black figure walking towards me, with his arm out, trying to grab me. It reminded me of those types of horror movies, and at that moment I ran. My heart starts racing, and I thought this was going to be the end of it for me, so I ran as fast as I could. I ran down the alley and down streets. I didn't dare look back. After becoming exhausted, I looked around me, and I noticed the area I was in. I was next to Ace Hardware, and I was close to my grandparents. I headed towards my grandparents' house because I was still far away from my house. I entered my grandparents and I was greeted by my aunts. They asked, "What are you doing out at this hour?" I lied to them and said that I wanted to get my brother's longboard. I wouldn't dare tell them what has happened tonight. I asked if they can give me a ride, and so they did. Upon arriving at my house, my parents were waiting for me, wondering where I was. I told them that my phone was out of battery, so I couldn't contact them. But I never told them about the person. They told me to charge my phone next time when going out. I went to my room because they were furious and turned to my older brother and told him about it. And he told me to never go to the park at night. There are strangers stalking individuals and known to attack. My experience left me in terror, and to those that go Pokemon Go hunting, don't go too far away from your place, and make sure to be aware of your surroundings. I haven't played Pokemon Go in weeks because the game still reminds me of that night. I grew up on a farm in Ontario. The following incident occurred when I was about 7 years old. At that time, me and my large family lived in a big old farmhouse. On this particular day, most of my family were not on the farm, so the only ones on there were my sister, my dad, and myself. It was late in the afternoon, so my dad was out in the barn doing chores, which would take him up to an hour and a half to complete. Meanwhile, my sister and I were playing a board game. I think it was Sorry, on the kitchen floor. Right when we're really getting into the game, we hear something moving around on the second floor, directly above us. There was a vent in the kitchen ceiling which led to the room above, so it was easy to make out the sound to be footsteps. They were heavy, as if a full-grown man was walking around in steel toe boots. The strange part is the room had nothing in it, so there was absolutely no reason someone would be in there. My sister and I both heard the noise, and as we do, we exchange a look of both curiosity and slight terror. We wait there for another minute to make sure we're not hearing shit, and sure enough, the footsteps are loud and consistent. Naturally, we burst out of that house and through the front door like two bats out of hell, and make a beeline for the barn where my dad is doing chores. After telling him about the noises, my dad assures us it was probably nothing, but we insist there is some shit going on upstairs, and that we weren't about to go back into that house. This annoys my dad, as it's almost bedtime and it's already difficult to get us to bed without us being terrified to enter our own home. He decides it'll be less of a hassle if he just clears the house to prove to us that there's nothing in it. So with us watching from the front lawn, my dad enters the house and proceeds to check all the rooms on the first floor before making his way upstairs. From where we're standing on the front lawn, We can see through the window of the second-story room, below which we heard the footsteps. As my dad is checking the downstairs, me and my sister both see a figure moving around the room. It's dark out at this point, too dark to make out any distinct features the figure might have had, so it was more of a shadowy figure. We only see the figure for about 10 seconds before it heads to one side of the room where it's out of our view. Not 5 seconds after losing sight of the figure, we see my dad open the room's one and only door, check it, and walk back out to clear the other rooms. As I said before, the room was empty, as in nothing but 4 walls and a roof empty. If there was a person in there, they would have had nowhere to hide when my dad entered the room. It's as if they vanished mere seconds before he turned the door handle. My dad cleared the rest of the house and comes back down to us on the front lawn. We frantically told him about the figure in the room, but he insists that there's no one in that room or any other part of the house, and passes the figure and the footsteps off as our overactive 7- and 9-year-old imaginations. I had other similarly terrifying experiences in that house, but those are stories for another time. For the rest of the time we lived in that house, I had a hard time sleeping, and often had nightmares about shadowy figures like the one I saw that day. I'm 23 now, and my sister's 25, and we both remember that day clearly in our minds. My dad has since become more open to the idea that maybe what we saw was real. I don't know the history of that house, but it was built in 1886, so a lot of bad stuff could have happened since it was built. I can, however, say for certain that that house was haunted, based off of all the shit that's happened there to me. I have had a lot of strange experiences in my house growing up, and I thought I would share a few. The house I grew up in was built in the 50s, and was a model for the neighborhood that would eventually build up around it. My mother actually grew up in the house first and eventually purchased it for my grandparents, which has kept the house in the family for almost 50 years. And counting. I spent quite a bit of time alone in the house growing up, with a strong sense that I was never quite alone. But it never really bothered me. That is, unless I had to go downstairs. Without fail, that would change the feeling in the house entirely. It's always cold down there and foreboding. It caused a sense of dread when you had to go downstairs, and I get chills just thinking about it. You'd imagine with that description that it's unfinished, but it's actually quite nice. It has a large family room with a TV and fireplace, along with a finished bathroom, computer room, bedroom, separate laundry room, and a large storage room. The storage room was the worst part of the basement, and hands down the place I liked the least. Its door, which was a sliding wooden door, much like all the other rooms in the basement, was also directly next to the TV and always left a horrible, uneasy feeling when I watched TV downstairs as a child. Anyhow, going downstairs was always a bit of a process. I would slowly descend the stairs, peek around the wall into the family room to make sure the coast was clear, then bolt for the light switch. Going back upstairs now, that was even worse, Every single time I would have to switch the lights off, lest I get in trouble with my father and, God forbid, sent back down to turn them off. And bolt up the stairs like my ass was on fire and a bucket of water awaited at the top. I have never once ran up there without the sense that I am being chased by something and was losing the race. Growing up, I would hear noises and even voices downstairs. While home alone, I would hear people running upstairs, which would prompt me into thinking that someone had come home, only to find that I was still alone. I would be called downstairs from what sounded like my mother, only to discover no one was there when I went down. It wasn't unusual for the lights to be off when peering downstairs, as my father was crazy about wasting power, and my mother only used the ones she absolutely needed, which would only include the ones inside the laundry room. Its door was under the stairs, meaning that I would never know if the call from my mother was legit or not until I would go downstairs, slide open its door and discover that the laundry room light was off, and that I was the only one home. Then, shortly after, realizing that I was standing in my basement alone in the dark. This happened often, and never got less gut-wrenchingly scary when it did. For a period of time while this was going on, I would have these dreams where I was downstairs doing what I always did in the basement, playing video games, watching TV, etc. But there would be a lady in a white dress of sorts, standing there watching me. I would look to my right, and she was there in the distance, standing still and arms down in front of her, watching. I would turn my head to the left and everything was just as it should be, except she would again be in the distance, by the far wall, standing and watching. Sometimes I would look all around me just to see if she would still be there, but turn again to find her sitting next to me, body straight, but head and stare fixed right on me. That is when I would immediately burst up awake, drenched in sweat. The unused spare bedroom downstairs also had a walk-in closet, housing old military uniforms and other jackets and clothing that were preserved in plastic covers. Sometimes as a child, friends and I would play hide-and-go-seek down there, and that would be my favorite hiding spot, since one could remain among the clothes even when someone was actively looking right in your direction. The clothes made a very distinctive sound when touched or moved, and nothing else in the house sounded like it. As I got older, and the weird basement activities began to intensify, I would often hear that noise before making my mad dash upstairs. The light switch for the family room is right outside the doorway to the bedroom, and when I would approach it to go upstairs, I would hear that rustling as if something was emerging from the closet. Seeing that I had a view of the open doorway into the pitch-black room from the light switch, this caused me to have to flip and bolt up the stairs for dear life, even quicker than normal. Like I mentioned, the activity in the basement ramped up as I got older. My then girlfriend, let's call her Lynn, and I would hang out downstairs, constantly, to avoid my parents. It was basically our own space, for better or worse. One day we finished watching a movie and she went to use the bathroom. While she was in there, I had to check something on my computer, which was up in my bedroom. Without thinking, I ran upstairs to quickly check it out. then moments later came back downstairs. She was out of the bathroom and was looking at me with what she calls her skeptical eyes. I asked her what was up, and she said, "Very funny." I was confused and asked what she was talking about. She explained that I had run up and down the stairs really quickly, then opened the storage room door and dragged something heavy out and in front of the bathroom door to scare her. I didn't know what to say. I tried to tell her that I just ran upstairs to check my computer and that I hadn't been downstairs at all, but she didn't believe me. Luckily, I had typed a few messages on AIM while upstairs and was able to show her the chat log times, which proved my point, but then at the same time freaked her out. She also realized that she never heard whatever was dragged in front of the door actually be dragged back to where it came from, which scared her even further. This happened to her several more times over the period of a few weeks. I could go on and on, but I'll end with this final story. Though I have dozens of stories I could write about, this is one that really sticks out in my mind as a major event. A few years later, Lynn and I were now married, and we were asked to dog sit for my mother and father while they went on vacation. My parents had 2 Shih Tzus, which they gated off to remain in the kitchen. Lynn and I decided we would just stay over for the few days, as my parents' house was, in a way, a small vacation for us as well. One night, like the beginning of a cliché horror movie, it began vigorously storming outside. The dark house would completely illuminate from the bright lightning flashes, only to then shake from the tremendously loud thunder just seconds later. The 2 dogs loved thunderstorms and never barked or freaked out. If anything, it likely helped them sleep, as I could never wake them to use the bathroom if one was in the area. Around midnight, as my wife and I laid in bed with the TV and lights off so we can go to sleep, I thought I heard footsteps on the stairs, but chalked it up to the storm. Shortly after, I heard the sliding door at the top of the stairs, which I had locked and could only be locked from the inside, slide open, and the dog suddenly started going crazy. I had never heard them bark like this in my entire life. I threw off my covers and told Lynn I am going to check on them. That's when we heard it, above the sound of the rain and their barking. We both suddenly hear a woman who sounds exactly like my mother speaking to them. I couldn't quite make out exactly what was being said, but I could tell it was in a very similar consoling tone that my mother would do if they were scared about something. I wondered for a moment if my parents had actually come home early, but quickly realized that I would have been notified, seen the car pull up, or heck, heard both back doors open, and then of course a struggle with the one-way lock on the sliding door. Not only that, the dogs would have been thrilled to see them, which was an entirely different bark. No, this was terror. They snarled, yelped, and vigorously barked over and over while the familiar voice of my mother was still speaking. I told Lynn I had to investigate in case it was an intruder. But deep down we both knew what we were dealing with. I crept out of bed, my sounds masked by the chaos happening both outside and inside the house. The door to the room led to the hallway, which was shaped like an L, and exiting the room would put you at the bottom of that shape. In other words, the end of the smaller line of an L letter shape, if that makes sense. Against Lynn's pleading, I crept out of the door and into the hallway. The walls leading from the bend in the hall to the room are lined with full-body mirrors, which nearly gave me a heart attack when lightning suddenly illuminated the hallway, revealing my reflection standing directly next to me. Needless to say, we both looked shocked to be there. I regrouped, shot Lynn the "you didn't see that" look, and got back to the task. I peered my head around the corner and saw both dogs with their backs pressed up against the gate, both looking up at something that was just behind the wall to the right and out of sight. I stood there, wondering what to do. Part of me wanted to just lock myself in the room with Lynn, and the other half wanted to say, "Fuck it," and just rush into the kitchen and deal with whatever I would find. I had spent my life rushing upstairs away from unseen fears in my house, and frankly, I wasn't a kid anymore, and I was tired of that shit. I glanced at Lynn again, then decided I was going in. I bolted towards the kitchen at full speed. I reached the gate in time to see both dogs instantly stop barking. The voice stopped, and both their heads just turned to look at me. I whipped the upper half of my body over the gate to peer into the kitchen, only to see it empty. I glanced down at them, and they are both suddenly calm but sitting in puddles of their own pee. Accidents of that nature never happened, so that was further confirmation to me that something was definitely wrong. I hop over the gate and walk to the sliding door at the opposite end of the kitchen, which was now unlocked and opened. The back door was still locked from the inside and closed like I left it. But despite it being 80 degrees outside and summer, the area in front of the back door was absolutely freezing. I glanced downstairs and it was beyond pitch black, and didn't seem to illuminate like the rest of the house did from the flashes of lightning. I had enough adrenaline at this point to just bolt downstairs into the darkness and confront my childhood tormentor head on. And oddly enough, I was damned tempted to do so. Rational thought kicked in, however, and I closed the sliding door and tended to the dogs, spending the next hour or so giving them a bath and cleaning the floor. Lynn donned her "you're a fucking idiot for doing that" eyes, but I actually felt good about it. I'm over that bitch and her tricks. Several weeks later, when my parents' vacation was over, I was visiting their house and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, which is right across from the sliding door to the basement stairs. I decided to sit down and tell her what happened that night we were watching the dogs. I mentioned the stairs and the strange woman's voice, and she went completely pale and froze. She explained that as a child, she would hear a voice that sounded very close to her aunt, which would trick her into coming down into the basement, though it would always be dark and empty. This was interesting, but I must note that her aunt was and still is alive to this day. She too was scared to go into the basement as a child because of this, and shared the sense of being chased up the stairs, even to this day. She also said, even recently, that while sitting alone at the table, she would sometimes hear someone stomp up the stairs at an inhuman speed, stop at the sliding door, but never open it. The dogs hear it as well, and they are not fans of this. So far to this day, I don't quite know what roams the house and why it does it. I just know that it's a woman, or that it can make itself sound like one. It's apparently a bit on the shy side when it comes to actually being seen. But I'm okay with that. I now take my sweet time going up the stairs though. I still get the sensation that I should be running for my life. Stories about the Hat Man during sleep paralysis, whilst dreaming or as an apparition, are common. Or at least more common than I realized. I also thought it only happened to me. My experience is a bit different from everyone else's that I have read or heard so far. It all began one night of deep sleep and a vivid dream. I became lucid in the dream for the first time, and I began to experience this strange out-of-context dream. It was not a usual dream, as my dreams often reflected the horrors of waking life. Rampant violence and maltreatment were the norm. So when the dream that night was about a different experience, it woke me up in the dream. The dream sequence was this. For whatever reason, I was at the beach and I had a lot of people around me, mostly female, and we were doing beach activities such as volleyball. Immediately, I knew something was wrong because the content was suspect. The beach, volleyball, ladies. As I became aware I was in a dream, all faded into nothingness and oblivion. At first, I was walking a gravel road, which just got darker and darker, until all that surrounded me was darkness. The black void I was in had no ground anymore, and I was effectively paralyzed in the dream. I didn't struggle, and then I saw it. He came out of the darkest corner and was even darker than the abyss we were in. I made out his trench coat and a hat, but nothing more than that. He was in silhouette. It stared into my eyes and I into his. His were blood red. This is where my story takes a twist from most that I've come across. It spoke to me. At the time I listened intently, yet the only thing I can remember that was said was the word at the end. You won't remember anything I've told you as soon as you stop hearing the sound of my voice. And as soon as he said that, I awoke. Years passed, but I never forgot. And after my encounter, I became and am to this day a lucid dreamer. Has anyone else spoken with this entity or had the entity speak to them? I'm a strong believer in the paranormal. Even though I am only 13, I have many stories like this. So for some background, my family always takes an annual trip to San Francisco every year. This year, however, we made some rather bad decisions on where to camp. We decided to stay in a hostel. For those of you who don't know what a hostel is, it's kind of like a hotel, but less expensive and better. This hostel, however, was an old military hospital. Like I said, I'm a very firm believer that the paranormal exists. We ate dinner, and then we went over to the game room, which is underground in the basement. Big mistake number one. After about 30 minutes, my parents told us that they were going to go to the room and play some games. They left me and my little sister alone in a basement at 11 o'clock at night in an old military hospital where many had died and spirits still lurked. Anyways, me and my sister stayed and played some pool. Everyone else in the hostel was asleep at this point, and we were starting to get a weird feeling, like we were being watched. I ignored the feeling until I began to feel breathing on my neck. I snapped my neck around to see what the hell was breathing on me. I turned to see my sister laughing. I told her it wasn't funny. She had really scared me. So as you can imagine, I was even more unnerved at this point. It was about midnight and I began to get tired. My sister kept nagging for just one more game. I agreed. This was a huge mistake. If I had known what was going to happen, I would have just sprinted the hell away. But I didn't. This is where shit gets weird. About 5 minutes after we started the game, I started to feel like I was being watched again. I told my sister and she just laughed. All of a sudden, pool balls began to be thrown at me. It was like a professional pitcher was pitching at the World Series finally. They were being thrown hard. The weird thing is, my sister didn't see any of this. She just saw me standing there with my eyes wide open. But I swear to God, I was under attack by pool balls. After I had dodged them all, I quickly sprinted back to the room, with my sister right behind me shouting, "Are you okay? What happened to you?" All the while she was laughing. I never told my parents about this. Before you blame this on drugs, keep in mind that I am 13. And I am pretty sheltered. I was not on drugs. I have never told anyone what happened except for my best friend, for I feared they would bring me to a mental asylum. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you've had any similar experiences. Also check out my YouTube channel, which is called Sub-Zero2121. I joined a cast to perform a play. The cast was small, and when you have a small cast, there is a lot of bonding. One of my castmates, whom I'll call Kay, asked me, "As a Wiccan, have you ever done a cleansing?" Of course I had, all the time, especially to my own home. So I told her as much, followed with, "Why do you ask?" She proceeded to tell me that she had an entity in her home that was causing her and her family issues, to the point of making her physically ill, nauseous. We talked more about what was going on in her home. She told me that the home had burned down and that a new home was rebuilt on the same foundation. We set up a day and a time for me to come over. From what she told me, a simple sage cleansing wasn't going to be enough. There is a herb called asafoetida. I don't know how else to describe it except to say this stuff smells like ass. I made a blend of asafoetida and sage and some other herbs and oils. On the scheduled day, I went to her house. You know that uneasy feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when something is wrong? That was what I felt. I conducted my self-protection before I went in. I set up in the kitchen, said the opening blessing, and proceeded with the entire home cleansing ritual by sparking up the incense mixture. We went from room to room reciting, basically, "Only good can come here, because only good comes from here." discord, disorder must leave. Everything was going smoothly, nothing unusual, until we got to one of the rooms. My incense mixture went out. I kept reciting the ritual I had written when, I shit you not, the incense went off. It was like crazy, like a smoke bomb. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, because I was. But we kept going. The last room was the kitchen where we started. Remember, I had set up in the kitchen. I didn't start the cleansing there. I recited the ritual. I got about halfway through when a scream went through the kitchen. It was over our heads and around us. I had Kay open a window and let it out. Once she closed the window, everything was calm and quiet. Once the plague closed, I didn't see Kay much. I did keep in touch with her to follow up and ensure everything was okay. It was for a while. But within a month, Kay was posting pictures of herself that were blurred and fuzzy. It was never the house. It was Kay who had the attachment. I also realized that she actually enjoyed the attachment, as she didn't want to get rid of it. After this experience, I'm finding there are many others like Kay. They have negative attachments, and even though there are ways to get rid of them, they don't want to. In a way, it's like martyrdom. Like a burden they just have to carry for others. Should they get rid of this? Hell yes. But you can't force an adult to get rid of a negative attachment. It has to be of their own volition. My story starts when I'm about 9 or 10. My parents had divorced a few years before, and my dad had stayed in our house since my mother left him. She packed up the car and put me and my sister in the back, and we drove away, across the river to a new house. We didn't really understand what was happening, but anyway, that isn't really part of the story. My dad stayed in our small 3-bedroom house, and before he remarried years later, he had 2 different roommates. One was a pretty nice guy that went to his church. We would see him a little bit when we were visiting our dad. But after this roommate got married, he got another roommate, a friend of his from high school. We'll call him MJ. He seemed nice, and I had seen him a few times before when our dad had visited him, taking me and my sister with him. When we would visit our dad, MJ was really nice to us. When I would get out of the bath, he would offer to brush my hair for me. When I was that age, I had very long and curly hair that tangled very easily, so one of my parents would always brush my hair for me to make sure it was done thoroughly. It always made me uncomfortable when he would tell me to come and sit with him so he could brush my hair. So after he had done it 2 or 3 times, I stopped going into the living room after my baths and waited in my room for my dad to be done helping my younger sister get ready for bed so that he could brush it for me. I was too young to realize that there could be anything wrong with MJ offering to brush my hair, and I didn't really understand why I didn't like it, so I didn't tell anyone. A few months later, we were visiting our dad and someone came over to the house to get his help for the car. My dad is a mechanic. There was a park 2 doors down from our house, and since our dad was busy, MJ offered to take us to the park. We were really excited, since we weren't allowed to go to the park by ourselves. After my dad got done helping his friend with their car, he walked down to the park to get us, telling us that he needed to go to the store. MJ offered to go with us and offered to drive us, since he had the station wagon. He knew we liked the station wagon because it had one of those super cool seats in the back that faced out of the back window. Well, I should say super cool to us little kids. At the store, we begged our dad to look at the toys, and since he was shopping in a different part of the store, MJ offered to go with us to the toy section. In the toy section, I headed straight to the Barbie aisle. I absolutely loved Barbies as a kid. I had over 25 Barbies, 2 Barbie houses, a Barbie car, just about everything. There was this one Barbie that I had wanted for a long time, and they had it there at the store, so I basically stayed there and looked at it the entire time. I'll never forget that MJ came up behind me in the aisle and started asking me questions about the Barbie and how much I liked the Barbie and stuff like that. Then he was quiet for what seemed like a long time, but was probably more like 30 seconds. But then he got up really close to me and whispered, "I'll make a deal with you." I looked up at him and asked, "What kind of deal?" He smiled and whispered again, "I'll buy the Barbie for you tomorrow, but you have to do something for me." I was excited by the thought of finally getting this Barbie, so I asked him, "What?" He whispered again, saying, "Tonight, after everyone is asleep, even your dad, I want you to come see me in my room." I definitely know that I thought that was weird because I asked, "Why?" He answered softly, "Just to talk. I get lonely. And we can talk about school. I just want to help you and get to know you." I know that warning bells should have been blaring in my head at this point, but it was only a slightly uneasy feeling. But I said, "Okay." After I agreed, he made sure to tell me that I couldn't tell anyone, not even my dad or my younger sister, that it was our secret. I couldn't think of anything else after that. But I was going to get my Barbie tomorrow. When I went to bed that night, it was on my mind. So, at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I lay in bed and listened for sounds that Dad might still be up. I didn't hear anything, so I crept down the hall to peek into the living room and kitchen. Everything was dark, so he was asleep. So I tiptoed back down the hall to MJ's closed door. I knocked really softly, and he opened the door and let me in, closing the door behind him. Then he went and got back in his bed. By now I was feeling pretty uneasy, so I stood next to the bed but not within reach and asked him, "What do you want to talk about?" He told me to sit down and patted the spot in front of him on the bed, but I told him I was okay and remained standing. Then he asked me a few questions about school and my friends, and told me to sit down with the same gesture of patting the bed. I brushed him off and remained standing. He asked a couple more questions, and again requested I come sit on the bed next to him, but this time saying, "I'm sure you're tired. You shouldn't just stand there. You might get sick or have an asthma attack from the night air." Side note, I've had severe asthma my entire life, and until I was about 15, it was above and beyond severe. I had to be careful about what I did and whose houses I went to in order to avoid triggering an attack. I finally relented. Like I said, I was a naive young kid. After I had been sitting on the side of his bed for a minute or two, he told me to lay down and rest, again expressing concern about my asthma. And like an idiot kid, I did it. I mean, come on. This was the 80s. I was raised in the South. You did what an adult told you to. Well, as soon as I laid down, the touching started. At first he was just rubbing me and talking to me, but then he tried to touch an even more intimate area. And that is finally when my alarm bells went off. I slid off the bed and tried to sound as nonchalant as I could when I told him, "I'm tired, I'm going to bed now." And I fled from his room as fast as I could. Needless to say, I didn't get my Barbie, but I also didn't tell anyone about what had happened. After that, every time I went to my dad's house for the weekend, he would find some way to have some time alone with me and ask me to come to his room that night, each time promising that if I did, he would get me the Barbie. Each time I didn't go on purpose. The next day, he would say, "You didn't come to my room. I was hoping to see you." And I would make an excuse saying that I had fallen asleep. My sister and I always woke up early, before our dad, and many mornings, I would be jolted awake to find MJ standing by my bed, staring at me. I would ask him if he needed something, and every time he would tell me that he thought he heard me wheezing. I thought I might have been having an asthma attack. The weird thing I didn't realize about MJ, that I found out years and years later, was that when my sister and I would go with my dad to visit him, before he became his roommate, we were visiting him in prison. I remember asking my dad if it was a school, like a boarding school for rich people, because I didn't really understand the concept of prison yet. It never even crossed my mind. I also found out that the reason he was in prison was for stalking a woman. He was so obsessed with her, and when she told him she wasn't interested, he flew into a rage and went to her house with a gun and just started firing into the house. Her 2 very small children were in there too. Luckily, no one was hurt, but he went away for a few years because of it. Well, eventually my horrifying experience finally came out. My mom started suspecting something was going on. She told me later that my behavior changed, and that I started always packing pajamas when I went to my dad's house, when usually I would just sleep in a nightgown or an oversized t-shirt. She confronted me about it, and I told her. It was horrifying and humiliating. The next morning, my mom drove me into town to my grandparents' house and called my dad and grandfather to work and told them to come to the house right then. She made this huge dramatic scene about it, and I'll never forget that for a second, my dad didn't say anything, and I noticed that his hands were balled up into fists. He lifted them both up and slammed them down on the arms of my grandmother's rocking chair, and one of the arms broke off right then. "I'll kill him! I'll kill him!" he screamed over and over. Then he just walked out, slamming the door behind him and tearing off down the street in his truck. It was scary. I'd never seen my dad scream like that, and had never seen him so angry. A few years later, my mom told me that my dad had driven straight to MJ's work and beat the ever-living shit out of him. One of his co-workers called the police, but MJ refused to press charges against my dad. My mother also told me that when his boss heard what my dad was screaming at him about, what he was accusing him of, he fired him. Next, I'm told my dad went straight from there back home and emptied every bit of MJ's things out of his house, and whatever he could, he broke in the process. My parents sat me down a few days later and talked to me about what happened, and asked me if I wanted to press charges against him. I didn't know what that meant, so they had to explain it to me, and when they did, I couldn't think anything about how embarrassing it would be to do that, so I said no. It was a long time before I would see MJ again. This is where the stalking part of the story begins. Fast forward half a dozen years or so, and I'm 16. My dad got me my first car, an old Dodge Charger, that he paid nearly nothing for and fixed up for me. The thing about this car is it was metallic gold, and there was just no other car like it in our town. It was very distinguishable, and everyone knew it was my car. My family owns 3 major businesses in our town, and everyone knew my dad, uncles, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Nearly everyone in town knew me, or at least knew who my family was. Sadly, this car never ran too well. It would only give me a couple of good months before it broke down for some reason or another. One day I was babysitting a couple of my younger half-siblings, and a little boy that I tended regularly, and I decided to take them to see a movie because it was too hot to play outside that day. On the way back from the movie, my car breaks down. I wasn't too far from my dad's shop, so I wasn't too worried about it. I knew a place fairly close that we could walk to, and I could use a phone to call him. This was the early 90s, so before cell phones were very popular. All I had was a beeper. We all got out of the car and we were preparing to walk to the little store from which I could call my dad when a van stops, obviously to see if I need assistance. It's the South. People are friendly. When the driver gets out of the van and starts walking towards us, it takes me a moment to realize it's MJ. When that hit me, my heart leaped and started beating really hard. I was instantly terrified and felt so nauseated, I thought I was going to throw up. He walked up and asked, "Do you need any help?" But I could tell that he didn't recognize me at first. I couldn't see anything for a second. I was in panic overload. But I finally found my voice and stammered, "No, thanks, I'll just call my dad, he's a mechanic." He squinted his eyes like he was confused. "Do you want me to take a look?" He stepped towards me and I took a step back. He stopped and his face froze. He recognized me. Panic flooded through my entire body. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. These 3 little kids were my responsibility. Next, he said, "Can I go get some help for you?" I think he was trying not to freak me out. And I was trying to be reasonable, so I replied, "Yes, please, my dad owns a shop right up the road. It's on Market Street. Ask for my dad's name. Just tell him I'm here and please come get me." But I knew I didn't have to tell him any of that. He knew where my dad's shop was. He knew his name. I just had to pretend I didn't know him, didn't recognize him. for my own sanity. He got back in his van, drove past us to the light, and turned right toward my dad's shop. I was terrified that he would come back, but he didn't. My dad raced to get us as fast as he could. A few months later, I was at work. I had been working part-time at Sears in the children's clothing department for about 6 months or so. And guess who walks in? Yep, you guessed it. MJ walked in with a woman, obviously his girlfriend by their body language. There were 2 little girls with them, and the girlfriend was obviously pregnant. They headed towards the infant section, which was usually where I worked because I had the best knowledge of all the car seats, strollers, cribs, and things because of all the kids running around my house. I knew a lot about babies. I ducked behind clothing racks and ran to the boys section and asked my co-worker to switch areas with me for a little bit, so hopefully MJ wouldn't see me. I seriously hid behind the video game counter, feeling absolutely sick to my stomach, sweating profusely, my heart beating so hard I thought it was going to come through my chest. After a few minutes, I checked to see if they had left. They were still there, and my appearance caused a different customer to call me, asking for assistance. I had to leave the sanctuary of the video game counter. I kept an eye on MJ and company, hoping that he wouldn't notice me while I was so exposed helping the customer. They paid for their selections and started heading out of the store past where I was. I turned my back, but had to turn around to answer a question. And when I did, his eyes locked on mine. I tried to keep recognition off of my face and look away quickly, but not before he gave me a discreet little wave as if to say, "Yes, I recognize you, and I know where you work." To say the least, he creeped me the hell out. But I was relieved when I saw them walk out of the store. A few weeks later, I'm leaving work, driving through a neighborhood on my way to my boyfriend's apartment, which isn't very far away. I look up into my rearview mirror and see a van behind me. It looks familiar. Suddenly, I realize it's his van, and I feel sick. I am definitely freaking out and not sure what to do. I turn a few times, and he stays behind me, and I'm positive he's following me on purpose. I decide my best bet is to keep going to my boyfriend's apartment and run up to his door, even if I leave my car just out in the middle of the parking lot. My boyfriend at the time lived in a busy, full college apartment complex. There was always multiple people out doing different things. I think that spooked him because even though he followed me into the complex, he didn't follow me all the way to the building I was going to. My boyfriend went out and looked around after I told him what was going on, but he didn't see MJ, thankfully. In another couple of weeks, I come out of work at the mall to find a creepy note under my windshield wiper. I go back into the building and cry. After I've calmed down, I ask a friend that works in the tool department to walk me out to my car and follow me home. A few days later, I'm driving around town, running errands and delivering parts for my dad. And I look up in my rearview mirror, and his van is there again. He's following me again. I had finally broken down and told my dad what had been happening, and he told me to tell him if it ever happened again. So that day, when I went back to the shop, I tell my dad. He tells me not to worry about it, he'll take care of it. I don't see MJ again for almost a year, My dad asked around, found out where he worked, went and confronted him, and freaked him out pretty good, I think. During that time, my dad got me a different car and sold my gold Charger. At least he wouldn't be able to spot me based on that. The new-to-me car was super common, in fact. One of my closest friends had one exactly like it. Same color, even. I eventually quit working at Sears after I was offered a courier job at a travel agency. It was better pay and a lot more fun. One of my responsibilities was shopping for the office supplies for both office locations. One day I'm in Office Max, or some store like that, shopping for supplies. I'm waiting in line to pay when MJ just walks in. I didn't see him at first, but I recognized his voice as he passed me. I jerked my head in his direction as soon as I heard it. And there he was. He stopped and looked at me. He smiled. "How are you, Becky?" He asked me. I wanted to vomit. I turned my head and didn't reply, trying to pretend like I didn't hear or see him. He stood there for a moment looking at me. It took everything I had not to burst into tears and run out of the store. When I finally paid for everything and went out to load up my car, I saw his van out there in the parking lot. I hurried as fast as I could to get out of there, but as I sat at the light, waiting to head back to the office, he pulled up behind me, clearly visible in my rearview mirror. When I got to the office, I left my car at the curb and ran inside without the supplies. The travel agency was run by a husband and wife team that I knew really well. The husband had been a teacher of mine when I was a freshman. He asked me where the supplies were, and I brushed him off saying I left them in the car. I would get them later, that I needed to go to the bathroom. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I collected myself after a few minutes and went back out into the office. The husband, we'll call him Alan, asked me if I was okay. I told him I was, but he knew me pretty well and insisted I tell him what was wrong. I gave him a general idea of what was going on without saying too much, and he insisted on unloading my car himself and then driving me home. Over the next year, I found MJ following me at least 8 or 9 different times, and there were a handful of notes left. They were all crazy. One asked me to call him and had his phone number. Another would say how nice I looked that day. The next would accuse me of ruining his life and his friendship with my dad with my lies. Sometimes they would tell me that he knew where I lived and he was going to come visit me soon. It was so absolutely horrifying. I felt like I was constantly crying and scared. I would avoid leaving the house as much as I could. My dad even called the police, but they were never able to find him, telling us that they hadn't been able to track down where he's residing, and that the van wasn't registered to him. Probably wasn't registered at all. It had been at least 3 months since MJ had tried terrorizing me, and I was starting to feel like I could breathe again. I'd started dating a Marine. Then we got engaged. I still hadn't seen or heard from MJ, so I figured he must have left town again. At some point, while I was engaged to the Marine, my dad asked him to go to a bar and shoot some pool with him so that they could get to know each other. After their night out, the next time my fiancé had me alone, he asked why I hadn't told him about MJ. I was shocked. My dad had told him about my past, I was mortified, but I got over it. My dad had told him how he had been stalking me before we had met, and that the police hadn't been able to track him down, but just that day an old friend had stopped in his shop and told him in passing that MJ was back in town and where he thought he was working. My dad told my fiancée all of this just in case he needed the information. A few days later, my dad told me he had given the information he had gotten to the police, but that when they went to pick him up, he wasn't there. A few months later, when the Marine and I were still engaged, I was working the office of my dad's shop for him for a few days, and one of my dad's friends came in to get his car worked on. It was a guy I'd never really liked because he always smelled like pot, but I felt obliged to be nice and make small talk with him while he waited for his car to be ready. He was talking to me about my dad. He asked me a few things about myself, asked after my sister and mom, and then asked me if my dad had told me about what happened to their friend MJ. My stomach dropped out, but I tried to be casual and answered no. He then told me that MJ had moved back here from New York and started working at some place I don't remember, but wasn't even there a week before he quit and went to work somewhere else. He only worked there about a month, when he went to lunch one day and just never came back. He told me he never went home either. His girlfriend didn't know where he was, and neither did his parents. They found his van about a week after he left for lunch and never came back, but they had no idea where he'd gone. Not much longer after that, the Marine and I broke up, calling off the wedding. He was hiding a lot of stuff from me and seemed to become more mentally unstable as time went on. He got more and more controlling and started scaring me. I felt like I had dodged a bullet not marrying him. I had my suspicions about what happened to MJ, especially when I started thinking about it a few years later, remembering how pissed my fiancé had been about what my dad had told him, how strong he was, how bad his temper seemed to be. No one ever saw or heard from MJ ever again. It's been over 20 years. I often wonder if I should have thanked my ex-fiancé for removing the nightmare from my life. At least one good thing would have come from that mistake.